What do you choose to believe? I've come across this idea of choosing a belief sporadically in comments both directed at me and at others, usually in the form of, you just choose not to believe in God. And I find myself a little bewildered at this, both at the idea itself and the usual lack of a response. The notion that one can pick their own beliefs. Did you choose what to believe? And for those of you that actually had to stop and consider that for a second, I'm going to ask you to think of the really obvious examples. Did you choose to believe that the sky is blue, that the sun will rise tomorrow, that fire is hot? Or instead, did you arrive at these views because of past experiences and your own observations? To truly believe something, there is some internal standard that has to be met. It's not the same for everyone, but some minimum reason has to be fulfilled, some required amount of evidence presented for you to accept something. And if you don't believe me, try changing your own fundamental beliefs on a whim. Try to convince yourself the sun won't rise tomorrow, or that you can fly by flapping your arms, that fire is only room temperature. Of course, you can claim all of these things, but can you truly choose to believe them? Can you so honestly believe that fire is cold that you'll stick your hand into an open flame without hesitation or bracing yourself for the inevitable burn? If you can't do that, you can't choose your beliefs. You can educate yourself. You can you can be exposed to new ideas, and beliefs can in fact change. But you don't have the final say in what you honestly believe, only what you claim to believe. As for myself and my worldview, it, it wasn't always what it is now. I was raised a Christian and firmly believed that there was a God and he sent his son Jesus Christ to this earth to save mankind. For me, it seemed as true and obvious as the sky being up, water being wet, and penguins having poor taste in real estate. Things changed for me rather unexpectedly. It wasn't that I began to doubt what I was told, though looking back I probably should have questioned those nagging inconsistencies a little earlier. No, for me, I've always enjoyed mythology. And one day, I started thinking about it. I'd always known that mythology was both today's fanciful stories and yesterday's religions, but one day, for no particular reason, I started to really think on it. Why are today's mythologies no longer religions people wholeheartedly believe and ascribe to as they once were? What makes today's religions so different than those of former generations? It was at this point that I began to ponder on how and why those ancient religions came to exist if they were wrong. I still believed in Christianity, but I was bothered by a few things. Christianity can be traced to a starting point many thousands of years after the beginning of recorded history. Now, the reason this is significant is because the Bible starts at Earth's creation, but the first believers in the Abrahamic God weren't the first people to believe in a God. Now, how is it that the God I believe to be real wasn't the God of the earliest religions? He created the world, he made man, and it was in contact with man from the very beginning. So why wasn't he the first God recorded in human history? I think it was at this point I began to have doubts. I wrestled with the idea for a while, considering that perhaps earlier people had known God by different names. It didn't seem unreasonable, what with all of the languages of the world and so many shared stories. In fact, it even seemed to support the idea. The common threads in so many different religions and mythologies is what gave me pause for a time. Stories of a global flood and numerous cultures and what have you. But even that toppled in time. After all, the earliest religions were polytheistic. Even some of the stories of a global flood belonged to religions that believed in multiple gods. Now, if God so directly dealt with man in the beginning, why then were the earliest religions not monotheistic? It was then that I came to the conclusion that these earlier religions didn't believe in the same God I did, and so my thinking turned to why they believed in these false gods. It's not a difficult thing to figure out. Natural phenomena that couldn't be explained by the science of the time were easily attributed to a god or gods. Moreover, they demonstrated this fact in the way they created their gods. Zeus would throw lightning bolts, or Thor his hammer, or Apollo drove his chariot across the sky every day, its wheel hub being the sun. Poseidon controlled the tides, Anubis, Hades, or any other number of supernatural beings caused death or had dominion over the dead. For me, the natural conclusion to draw from this was that just because we can't explain something doesn't mean it's unexplainable, only that we're incapable at the time. Thus, we shouldn't attribute such things to a supernatural being. Not that a supernatural being can't be the cause, but that instead it's poor evidence for one, and not a reason to believe one exists. I then began to consider my own religion. Was it any different? Did the founders of my religion have a better, or even different reason for believing in God and Jesus? And honestly, I was unable to think of any. Every argument I came up with just seemed like more of the same. Thinking about the wonders of the stories I had heard, about God rescuing the Israelites from Egypt, the story of Jesus' disciples seeing him again after he rose from the dead, the walls of Jericho, I thought of all the times God got directly involved with human affairs, and they were all incredible, marvelous even, but so were the Greek, Norse, Egyptian, and Chinese myths. In them, the gods also got directly involved with mankind. I was able to recall countless stories about gods intervening or communicating with man, and the events of these stories and their characters were all once thought to be true. They were fully believed at the time. It was as real for them as today's religions are for their followers, but now they're thought of as nothing but myths. So what made the Bible stories different? Are they different? It was at this time that I was really struggling with my beliefs and decided it best to turn to the Bible. That was the last nail in the coffin, so to speak. I read through the Bible and I couldn't rationalize all the contradictions I saw there. God was often described as eternal, everlasting, and unchanging. My immediate thought was, well, if that's the case, why does God not visibly intervene now as he did in biblical times? I saw no pillars of fire and smoke guiding chosen people, no prophets preparing for a cataclysmic disaster and then one happening. I saw no Tower of Babel events, despite the fact that our skyscrapers dwarf anything in the ancient world. I saw no raining frogs, no prophets ascending to heaven on fiery chariots, nothing supernatural. Either God changed and the Bible was wrong, or there was no God and the Bible was wrong. On top of that, the events that were described in the Bible that should have left behind very tangible evidence failed to produce said evidence. Foremost in my mind was Noah's flood. Geology just didn't seem consistent with the global flood. It became difficult for me to excuse these as God's mysterious ways. He had no problem revealing himself in biblical times and making his presence and will known. Then suddenly he gets shy and even decides to wipe any evidence of his existence from the world. I think the last thing I did before I truly no longer believed in a God was to pray. I recalled a certain passage from the Bible, James chapter 1 verses 5 and 6. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God that giveth to all men liberally and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. But let him ask in faith, nothing wavering. For he that wavereth is like a wave of the sea, driven with the wind and tossed. My prayer was simple, it was earnest and sincere. A request for some small understanding. Do you exist? If the Bible is the Word of God, why isn't it consistent? Describing the feeling I got is something I can't adequately do. I genuinely thought I would know, or at the very least my faith would be reaffirmed after that prayer. There was a certain expectation for a while, which after a time faded. I remember kneeling there in the dark, and at that moment I no longer believed that God existed. The idea just failed to come through in every way. I was unable to think of any way the Christian ideology had origins different from early religions. I saw numerous contradictions in the supposed word of an all-powerful, all-knowing God, and finally the lack of even the smallest feeling to my final prayer. I continued reading the Bible for a time, thinking perhaps I was wrong, and I would one day believe as I once did. I'd be ushered back into the fold, so to speak. But that never happened. I only saw more evidence that Christianity was without merit. I suppose the few of you that have survived to the end of my rather boring anecdote might understand I never chose to stop believing in God. In fact, I made every effort to believe, but in the end I just couldn't. I was unable. Like you, I don't choose what I believe or what I don't. My beliefs and my views are dependent on that minimum requirement, that balance of evidence, plausibility, and reason. Now, this does raise a few questions about faith versus belief. Oftentimes, we have a hard time believing something concerning our world, such as a scientific theory, for example. When that happens, we actually require a lot of evidence to convince us. With faith, however, we seldom have that same requirement. Now, do we rely on faith to believe in things we'd like to be true instead of the evidence we require elsewhere? And if so, do we do this because we know that what we want to be true, what we want to believe in, simply wouldn't have said evidence?